Hi everyone, this is Russ Connie again with Club Benchmarking. We're going to go ahead and get started. If people come in a little bit late, they'll just join in where we are. I appreciate everybody joining us today. It's going to be a quick webinar. We like to do these fast ones. We call them fast fact webinars, but we like to do these quick 30, maybe 40-minute with questions webinars. People seem to like those more than the hour and a half. So I appreciate everybody hanging on today. We're going to probably have a little more material than we could really cover in a half an hour, but we'll fly through some stuff, and hopefully it'll just inspire some thinking and some questions in folks. First, I do want to thank the Club Tax Network and all of their CPA firm members. We do lots of webinars in Club Benchmarking, but this one specifically was arranged and put together in conjunction with the Club Tax Network, and that's a network of, I don't know the count, I should learn that, quite a few CPA firms around the country that really have expertise in the club field. And so that's a group that gets together and shares lots of best practices and club information. We're part of that network. So this was introduced to you, this webinar, through those partner firms. So we appreciate that, and we encourage you to work with those folks. We think they're the best in the industry in terms of the club business. So what we're going to talk about today is the private club business model. It's really the highest level discussion that we do in Club Benchmarking. I think a lot of you are probably familiar with us already, and some of you may not be. And some of you may have already heard us talk about the available cash model and the private club business model. But it really is the right place to start. And we're going to be, just for your own information, we're going to hopefully be doing a webinar like this that's rolled out through the Club Tax Network firms every 6 or 8 weeks, and they'll be on different topics, and some will be a little bit deeper dive into food and beverage, of course, maintenance, but this one is the highest level. I think it's the right place to start. So it's really going to be about how do we frame and understand the business model of a private club, and then really more importantly, why is that important? Why is it an important thing in our view for every club to understand that there is a consistent model in the industry and what their model is. So these are some of the other topics that we'll be doing over time in some of these other Fast Facts webinars, and we would certainly encourage folks to attend those. And some folks on the webinar may even be Club Benchmarking subscribers, or some are not, obviously. But that's okay. This is still it's about education, and if folks end up joining, that's great. But if not, this is just good education for you to take regardless of what you do. In terms of today's goals, there's a few. We really initially, as I mentioned, want to frame and define, at least through our work over the last 5 years in Club Benchmarking, what is the private business, what is the private club business model? The industry lived a long time thinking that there is no consistent model in this industry, and that all clubs are unique, special, and different. And they are in some ways, but like any other industry, there is a common business model that threads this industry, and we're going to talk about that, and we're going to show how we in fact measure it and how you should really measure it in our view. I think the other important goal here is to consider the perspective of, if every board member knew and understood what we're going to talk about today, our belief is it would change the industry. And everybody on this call knows, whether you're a board member or a controller, as most of you probably are, some GMs, I'm sure. The challenge in the industry around governance and the lack of depth of understanding that board members have around the club industry and the club business model is a problem. It's a big problem in the industry, and we think using these facts and information helps that. So that's one of the goals, is just to think about it from that perspective. Understand why you need to know your club's business model. We'll talk about a couple other KPIs, but generally that higher level thing, and then we'll learn how to frame your own, whether you do it manually or you use a tool or a platform like us to do that is up to you. But learning how to understand your own is pretty important. I always like to take a minute and frame the industry a little bit, because there is some unique aspects to this industry. It's a $20 billion industry, but it's extremely fractured. The average club is about a $6.5 million revenue club. The biggest is $95 million. So it's an industry with lots and lots and lots of players, all of them relatively small compared to the size of the industry. And the point I really want to bring in here is, let's just say there are about 5,000 private clubs. We tend to work in the CMA world, so we call it 3,000. But either number, and you've got an average of about 11 people on a board. So you've got today 33,000 people walking around who in their mind have the responsibility of governing those 3,000 or 5,000 clubs. And by the way, every year, a third of those 33,000 people turn over, and you get a new 11,000 people, and every 3 years, there's an entire new set. So what are the odds that that group of people, as they come into the industry, really understand the industry in time to really do an effective job of governance? It's a big challenge, and the quicker that clubs can educate their board members on what really matters and what really, is not a strategic item, the quicker that can happen, the more effective that board can be early on, and frankly, the less trouble sometimes that board can get the club into. We won't worry about that. People understand this process and politics in every world, and unfortunately in clubs, politics tends to trump process. Our goal, at least, is to try to get them equal, so that you don't have politics, the big P, and process, the little p. But now, as we get into the industry business model in and of itself, some of you may have seen this chart, but this is when we started digging into this maybe 3 years ago, 3.5 years ago, and trying to really understand the industry. We had 1,000 clubs worth of data, but we really hadn't dug into it yet. And so this top pie, and this is actually my partner's club, Ray Cronin. This represents the revenue from his club. It's a very heavy food and beverage. It's a golf-only club, but they do a lot of eating and drinking, and 47% of their revenue came from food and beverage. Now, they broke even on food and beverage, so it produced zero cash. You couldn't fund anything with that 40% of the revenue. All it did was pay for itself from a food and beverage perspective. So when we netted that out, what we found was that really the cash drivers of a club are dues, not a surprise, and golf operations, greens fees and cart fees, where essentially it's a high contribution to that revenue. There's very little cost associated with it. So that led us to really ask ourselves two questions down this path. Where did the cash come from to run a club, and where does the cash go? Right? Simple question. Where does the cash come from? Where does it go? How do we pay for the course and the buildings and all the people? Where does that cash really come from? And so what we did is we focused on the sources and uses, not so much of revenue, but we tried to dig in and say, what's the real usable cash? In effect, what's the gross profit that the club generates? And in that, we said, let's certainly separate operating funds from capital funds, because we think it's critical that clubs do that, and the clubs that don't do that, frankly, have some blurry lines between those two important facets of the club. And so what we found by identifying the answer to those two questions, or really the one question, it showed us a couple things. And we're gonna prove it to you today if you haven't seen it already. That shows clubs are far more uniform than people thought. There are attributes of clubs that are big clubs in California, small clubs in Massachusetts, medium clubs in Florida. Everyone would say you can't compare those clubs. We're actually going to show you that there's tremendous consistency between those clubs, and it's critical that everybody understand that, because understanding that consistency is the gateway to helping them understand their own club. It also shows that it's obvious that every club needs to understand this, and it's clearly necessary for boards and owners to understand this, and we'll make that clear in a minute. There's two key terms we want to define here as we get into it. Available cash. It's effectively the gross profit of the club. It's the cash you generate that helps you pay for all the fixed operating expenses that we're going to look at in a minute. It's really that gross margin that funds the club. And I think an important note is to think that it's different than revenue, in that all revenue is not created equal. Think $1 of dues revenue versus $1 of food and beverage revenue, and it makes it pretty obvious. And then basically just net available cash. So essentially, what's the bottom line operating result of the club? Did you break even? Did you have a surplus? Or did you have a deficit? Obviously, if people have been in the industry for a while, they've experienced, I'm sure, all three of those. So by understanding this business model, we're going to be able to frame, just today, just 5 key questions and understand them a little better. And again, if you could imagine that every board member in the country understood enough to ask these 5 questions and to understand the answers to these 5 questions, it could change the industry overnight. Now, we can't change the industry overnight, but what we have seen time and time again is we do change boards overnight, individual boards overnight, which can have certainly a big impact on the club within year. So we can't change the industry overnight, but in effect, when boards really understand this, we can change clubs, quote unquote, overnight. So those questions are, what is our operating revenue and gross margin? Where does our gross margin come from and where does it go? Are we break even, surplus, or deficit? How much capital income do we need? And are we generating the correct amount? And then I tossed in at the end, just because it's such a hot topic, is food and beverage a profit center or amenity? You can imagine if every board in the country could answer these questions about their club, it would literally change the industry. It certainly would change, certainly does change those clubs. So we'll skip through, we'll take a quick look at this. So when we look at this, there's an actual equation we'll look at in a minute that looks at the revenue you generate and the sources of those revenue, and then the gross margin you generate, because it's that gross margin that's going to pay for the things that we're going to look at in a minute in the club. So if we just see, the blue line here represents for a large set of clubs the revenue, operating revenue for those clubs, and in fact the yellow line represents the available cash or the gross profit. That's the money that you really have to spend when you're doing a budget. And you're looking at things like G&A and the course and your building's operations and things like that. This is the money that pays for all those other things. The biggest delta between these two is F&B revenue, frankly, which, as you know, $1 of revenue typically brings in about $1.10 worth of expense. So that doesn't generate any cash. And when we look at those two things consistently in the industry, we find that ratio between those two is about 60%. So we go around and we say, hey, at the median in the club industry, the gross margin for a club is 60%. 60 cents on the dollar of revenue comes back to the club as gross profit that they have to fund all their fixed expenses that they use to pay for all the amenities and things around the club. Now, there's a big disparity. There's definitely variation, and in fact, if you're down here in the 50s for your gross profit, you're probably struggling mightily to generate enough money to break even operationally. In fact, clubs that convince themselves incorrectly that if they could just get the next banquet, more and more F&B revenue will help fund the club. Since we know that F&B does not contribute cash to the club, it only contributes revenue but not usable cash, you actually drag your gross margin down as you increase your food and beverage revenue, because it's revenue but it's not cash. So I think you'll that becomes pretty obvious. But people behave that way all the time. So when we look at where does the one question, where does the cash come from to run this club? And we net out food and beverage. So if you're one of the few clubs that makes money in food and beverage, you'd have a little tiny slice that comes from that. But by and large, the industry doesn't have a food and beverage slice and sources of gross profit. And you find there really are only two sources for clubs with golf that matter. It's dues, which very consistently is 78–80% in the industry, and it's golf operations, so it's greens fees, cart fees. So the important teaching moment here is that there really are only two knobs to turn if you're trying to generate more cash in the club, and it's dues and it's golf operations. There's an equation. For the sake of time today, I'm not going to run through this equation, but there is a specific equation. Actually, the best thing to do, there's an available cash model white paper right on our homepage, clubbenchmarking.com, at the bottom. To dig into it and understand it even more beyond today, that's a great thing to download, so I would recommend you do that. On the uses side of cash, where does the cash go? We also find extreme consistency in the industry. We see these ratios all day long. So where does every club in the country use its available cash, its gross profit? It uses it for course maintenance, for G&A, for what USFRC calls fixed expenses, which are your property tax, liability insurance, and interest on debt. It's your buildings, operations, and maintenance, and it's your golf ops labor. And finally, it's any sports and non-golf sports and recreation expense, pools, tennis, that kind of thing. And it's extremely consistent. We see these ratios all day long, and it turns out there's a natural balance point. So you can't just arbitrarily decide, hey, we really love golf, So we're going to spend 75% of our available cash on course maintenance. You can't do that because then you can't fund the other things that need to be funded. And so what we find consistently, not every club is identical, but very consistently, about 50% of the available cash spend or gross profit spend goes to overhead, G&A, your fixed expenses in buildings, operations, and maintenance. And about half goes to the fun stuff, the amenities, which in this case shows course maintenance, sports, and golf ops labor. So that's a very consistent relationship in how clubs allocate. And now this gets to the whole theory about budgeting, right? How do you budget inside your club? If you understood that you have this proportionality of functions that you have to budget across, you have a different perspective on that budgeting. It's not dollar amounts. You're not asking the club down the street how much they spend on course maintenance, because it doesn't matter how much they spend. What matters is what proportion of your available cash are you spending, or can you afford to spend on your course? That's the only thing that matters. And in fact, I call it the 40% rule. There's another relationship here, which is about 40% is spent between course maintenance and non-golf sports. So if you're a golf-only club, you're spending 40% on course maintenance. If you're a diverse country club, you might be spending 15 or 18% on the yellow slice non-golf sports, and you're down to 25 or 22% on course maintenance. Those two things are elastic, and they accordion between each other. But it's a good way to understand, what is the strategy of our club? Are we a golf-only club, or are we intending to be a diverse amenity club? And that allocation split shows that. So this is just the basically, you have your available cash that gets allocated across all of these different functions, as we saw on that pie, and you end up with a net available cash, which is effectively the break-even of the club. And here we can see in the industry, this is a slice of the industry. You've got about half of the clubs have an operational deficit, and about half of the clubs have an operational surplus, and a bunch of them are right around break-even. But we're getting to now that though answering those questions. And again, if clubs and boards understood these questions, what's our operational revenue? What's our gross margin? Where does it come from? Where does it go? And did we produce enough or not to break even operationally? Or in fact, were we at the deficit level and had to in fact steal some capital income to patch up operational reserves? That is a view of the business model of the club, and that's all more critically, that's a view of the sustainability of that business model, right? If you've got a year where you have a loss, that's okay. You can find ways to patch that up. But consistently, year after year, if you're stealing your capital income to patch up operations, that's a sign that you don't have a sustainable business model. Now, when we work with clubs and clubs use it, they dig in deeper and understand, is it the dues engine? What's driving that problem? Is it too few members? But certainly, it's not a sustainable place to be, to steal your capital, which means you're underfunding your capital investment in the club, and you start that very dangerous spiral where the club starts to look shabby, it gets harder to find members, and the whole thing ends up spiraling. So the sooner you know this, especially if you're in a competitive environment, the better, because there are 15% of the clubs in trouble, and especially if you're in that. It doesn't really matter whether you're healthy or not healthy. Knowing where you are is critical, because you always want to understand, are we in the right trajectory? Are we in a healthy, sustainable place? If we are, great. Let's watch the indicators and make sure we stay there. If not, okay, let's tweak the indicators in the right direction so that we get there as soon as possible. I love these next two charts because they even, honestly, they even amaze me. People look at this and say, okay, that's great, but how consistent is this really? I'm going to give you a couple examples. You can imagine all the time we hear that, well, I can't compare to a 36-hole club. I only have 18 holes, and vice versa. I have 54 holes. I can't compare. I need to only compare to 54-hole clubs. And that's because they're thinking of themselves in terms of dollar amounts, not as a proportional business model. So here we have the allocation, the use of available cash in 18-hole clubs and 36 through 108-hole clubs. Clearly, in any traditional model, you'd say, well, we can't compare those two. Well, let's look at the way they spend their money. They allocate their available cash. Let's just use the 40% rule because some of them, even though they're the same here, some of them might be diverse country clubs and might be golf clubs. But basically 40% going to these two amenities, 39%, I'm sorry, 38% here, 39% here. G&A, 2022. Fixed expenses, 8-9. Buildings, operations, and maintenance, 18-18. Golf ops labor, 10-9. And this represents a throwing off a surplus. So big clubs have been throwing off a little more surplus. But it's identical. So when a club's thinking about, am I spending the right amount on my course, it's not a dollar amount. You can't ask the course down the street how much you're spending in dollars because they can spend, you might spend $1 million on your course. Club 3 miles away might spend $2 million on the same 18 holes. But chances are, what we've seen, they're spending, I don't know, 34% of their available cash, and you're spending whatever, 30 or 32% of your available cash. That's the consistent number to think about. Same thing on country clubs versus golf clubs, right? So as I said, if you're a golf club, you spend the whole 40% on course maintenance, whereas you have that split here, but the rule of 40 holds. So I didn't mean to take too much time here, but the consistency of this business model in this industry is tremendous, especially coming from the starting place of people that thought there was no consistency. So take this to heart and use it, and want to understand where your club is, because it's crucially important. And if your boards understood this, they'd have a different perspective on their club. So then we look at, does size or location matter, right? The traditional thinking has been, yes, of course, I'm a $3 million club. I'm not going to compare to a $15 million club. And location, of course, I'm in Palm Springs. Why the heck would I want to compare to, Denver, Colorado, or something like that? And so what we did was, just as an example here, we took the entire database of clubs, and then we compared it against a group that calls themselves the Alliance. It's 16 U.S. Open level clubs. You all know the names: Congressional, Olympic, LA Country, Atlanta Athletic. They are a set of clubs that if anybody could say, we're different, we're special, we can only compare to ourselves, it would be that group of clubs. And vice versa, where clubs would say, well, I don't want to compare to Congressional because they're a whole different animal. And so when we look at their sources of cash, we find, it's pretty obvious. It's the same. Their business model relative to where their gross margin, their gross profit comes from, is exactly the same as anybody else in the industry. And then we look at their uses of cash. Again, these are clubs that have held U.S. Open championships. It's the same. I'm not saying everyone is the same. They have campuses, not clubhouses, so they spend a little more in buildings, operations, and maintenance. They're diverse amenities. So here's where, you see that 40% rule split, and the yellow slice is bigger and the green slice is smaller. But, they're still living by 50% overhead and basically 50% to amenities, just like everybody else is. So understanding that it's a business model that you're managing and funding and driving, and it's the health and sustainability of that business model, which is the critical discussion and the strategic discussion, not how do we get more banquets, not, what is the head waitress or waiter making. Those are all tactical details that it might be worthy of a discussion at some point, but certainly not in place of what does our business model look like. So that was the size of the club. By the way, these are on average $6 million clubs, and these are on average $18 million clubs. Okay, so 3 times difference in size, yet clearly, from a proportionality perspective, they adhere to the same business model as everybody else. So then we look at regional. Is there regional variation? And there's variation to some degree, but it's by and large the same. 60% in the industry, and basically plus or minus a few percentage points, the gross margin of a club, no matter where you are, is the same because it's a business model. It's just like if you looked at car dealers, insurance agents, real estate firms, you'd see consistency of business model across the country. And while clubs are unique animals in that your membership is unique, and clubs have different personalities, but they all adhere to a business model. Course maintenance, essentially the same. Actually, the West Coast does allocate a little bit more. Again, not dollars. From a business model perspective, they allocate a little bit more of their money towards course maintenance, but not significantly different. Food and beverage, you know, the median is, well, I won't get into that yet. We haven't talked about food and beverage. G&A, we've got basically everybody spending the same on G&A. Golf ops labor, the same regionally. You know, people would say, well, I'm in the Northeast. You know, I'm only open 6 months a year. Well, I'm open, you know, 12 months a year here and here. And so how can they be the same? Because it's not a dollar amount we're talking about. It's a business model perspective. So, you know, for the sake of time, I want to move on. But basically, the proof in the pudding is there is no variation across size or location of club relative to the business model. And, you know, discussing tactical details before you've discussed and understood the business model is kind of in a way a waste of time. And it's certainly not as fruitful as the discussion is intending to be. You want to have fruitful discussions that are valuable, not discussions that, you know, are heated but aren't necessarily valuable. This is not necessarily right to the business model, but I'm just bringing it up because it's a key factor. We look at the net of food and beverage as a percentage of available cash because that's what dictates, hey, is your loss or gain, loss mostly, in food and beverage, you know, is $500,000 loss a big number or a small number? Well, it depends. What percentage of your gross margin is that subsidy? If it's 4% of your gross margin, then you're right down the middle of the industry. If it's 15% of your gross margin, well, that's pretty steep. And unless you have a really serious dues engine, you're probably going to have a hard time having an operational break even if you're down here. But looking at it relative to available cash or gross margin is what puts food and beverage in context. And you get away from the discussion of how the heck can we be a $2 million F&B operation and lose $100,000? Well, because look, here's break even. 3/4 of the clubs in the industry lose money on food and beverage. And this answers the question of, is food and beverage an amenity or a profit center? It's clearly an amenity in the industry. And this isn't us saying what we think it should be. This is us just reflecting what is reality. So that's an important point there. And then the last data point, and I know I'm coming close on time, so I want to, you know, wrap things up shortly, is capital generation, because it's not part of the quote-unquote operational business model, but it's critical to the sustainability and health of the club. In fact, I'm starting to come to the argument in my own brain that capital income and capital investment in the club is actually the most critical sustainability factor for a club. If you're not investing in the club, keeping it looking good, you know, building out the new little dining areas or whatever amenity it might be that current and, more importantly, future prospects are going to want, you know, you're not going forward, you're falling backward. So capital generation is critical, and we look at capital generation from the perspective of net of operations. So if you lost money in operations, you had to patch that up. So net of that, what did you do? What was your capital generation look like? There's an equation here, but, you know, we find the middle of the industry produces capital, net capital, to the tune of about 11% of operating revenue. Now, it doesn't come from operating revenue, so that's just a sizing scheme. So if you're a $10 million club and you were typical in the industry, you would have generated about $1.1 million in capital after patching up any operations if you had to do that. And so we call, you know, the reality is the clubs that are down around here are what I call somewhat starved, and the clubs that are down here are very starved. I mean, these are clubs, if you look, these are the 15%ers. These are the clubs that after operations and after all their capital income, they still didn't achieve a break-even number, which means they had to steal from cash reserves or somewhere else just to break even operationally. So, you know, these are the clubs that are in critical trouble, and it's a good thing that, you know, this zero line isn't up here in the industry, otherwise the whole industry would really be in trouble. So there's a, you know, if you're down here, you really want to understand it, and it's not, you know, this isn't calling napalm in on yourself. This is, you know, helping the club understand where it is and making the right decisions. 9 times out of 10, the data, when people use it, the data shows that the club is actually very well managed, and we might tweak 1 or 2 things, but basically it's well managed, so stop talking about, you know, the nonsense and, you know, focus on maybe getting a few more members in. That's what most of the clubs find when they look at the data. Some clubs find serious problems, and if they don't turn themselves around, they're not going to make it. So, that's an important thing. So the key takeaways are, there is a common business model in the club industry. We frame it, we honestly feel like, this available cash model, this view has changed the industry, because when an industry or an individual club thinks that, well, we're different than everybody else, so that's why we do it like this, and that's why, we have a loss in this, or whatever it might be, that's rationalizing bad behavior because they don't understand that they really do have a business model. So you really want to understand that, where you are in that business model, and it's very critical. It is based on this proportionality of where does my cash come from and where does my cash go. As we saw, it is independent of scale and geographic location. I will make one comment on that. There is one place in the country thus far that I've seen there is some difference. It's not a difference in the business model, but it's a difference in the allocation within that business model, and that's in the Palm. There might be a few. That's in the Palm Desert area in California. Their rule of 40 is actually more like a rule of 50. They really truly do allocate more towards those amenities, the course maintenance and the sports. And so we ask, where does that come from? They run with thinner G&A. The industry runs on 22, 24% going to G&A. The desert clubs run on 12 to 14%. And I think it's because they're so extremely seasonal that they just run with very thin G&A staff, and they just have to deal with it when it gets to their busy season. That's the only place in the country that I've seen what I would consider a measurable difference. So it doesn't change the fact that they're still part of a business model. It just says, hey, we're going to allocate a little bit more to those. F&B is not a financial driver in clubs. We have a whole webinar we do on that. We could spend 3 hours just talking about that. But, this is the teaching moment by that one chart. And then capital generation is absolutely critical. And again, it's not just capital income, because you want to look at, net of operations. Did I steal some capital to patch up operations? Net of my leasing payment flow, which we treat as a capital flow. What did I really have left over? It's what I call the net of the club. And you don't really know if you have enough or not unless you know how much you need. And that gets into things like capital reserve studies, which are always obviously a good idea to do to make sure that am I generating enough when I need it. So, that's the takeaways. Why, finally, last slide, why is it important to know your business model? Hey, determine if your club model is sustainable. Are we on an okay path? What radical, do we need a radical shift in something? Do we need to get the board focused off of something and onto something else, which is quite typical for clubs that are in trouble? Focus the discussions on what matters. Assess that, when things change. If you're looking at these key indicators, we only looked at a couple. We didn't look at the labor ratios or other key ratios. But when you're watching your club and you know where the club is in a healthy, sustainable model, when you see these things change, you can quickly get them back on track. Whereas if you run 5 years heading in the wrong direction, it's very, very hard to get things back in the right direction. So, knowing is always better than not knowing. It's really, I always get a little upset, honestly, when I see there's a lot of good people, GMs mainly, in the industry that get under stress for politics and frankly, get fired because the club doesn't understand what's really important. And the board is not working off of fact, but it's working off of politic and opinion. And we see it. If the data goes in and you get them straightened out, it can help that. It's a shame to see that, and there's a lot of that going on these days. It's a problem. Communicate. So if you're going to have a dues raise, a dues increase, and the membership is not happy about that, we believe clubs should raise dues every single year. But you can show them, hey, clubs run on a dues to revenue ratio of 50%. We're at 45%, and we haven't had a dues increase in 4 years. Our dues engine is anemic and is going in the wrong direction. So when you can justify this stuff and explain to the membership or to staff, here's the decision we're making and here's why we're making it, it changes the acceptance level of that. And obviously budgeting and planning is very useful for that. That becomes kind of self-evident. So there are a lot of fast fact webinars you can look at on archive. Again, we'll be delivering more. There's that available cash model white paper, which I think is a good read to dig in a little bit deeper. And then if there are any members that you haven't had an online review of your club for a while, we do those every day, all day. So you can go onto this website and schedule your walkthrough, and we'll bring you through your club and run your available cash report and look at your KPIs with you. And if you hadn't had a refresher in a while, a lot of people are just getting their 14 data in now, but certainly, always feel free to take advantage of that if you are a member. So, keep an eye out for additional notifications of webinars coming out. We're happy to do them. And what I'm going to do is turn it over to Terry Finan from our group just to see if we have any questions. If you have any questions, I should have mentioned it earlier. I don't know that I did. If you have any questions, there is a chat box over on the right side. If you have that little GoToMeeting control panel, down on the lower right side, there's a chat box. So we'll give it a minute. If anybody has any questions, they can type into that. We'll be happy to answer them in real time. If not, and you just want to email me a question or something, whether it's about club benchmarking as a product or just what we heard today, I'm happy to answer any questions.
So Russ, I'm here. The way the chat pane is set up in this session, the questions go directly to you.
Oh, okay.
As opposed to being visible to the entire audience.
Got it.
Or you can, you can also just open up the mics and see if anybody has anything.
Okay, let me do that. Yeah, let's do that. Let's open up the mic since I wasn't watching the chat box. Let's do this. So there's going to be a little bit of background noise, but let's just open them up and see if anyone's got any questions. So everyone's mic is open. Does anyone have any questions before we close it up?
2014 yet. No. Well, I just got it this morning. So.
All right. Great. Well, I think that'll do it. I hope it was valuable. And again, there's lots more articles and case studies and white papers on our website, so feel free to poke around there. And keep an eye open for other notifications. I'm not sure what the next topic is going to be. It might be dues and membership, but we hope to see you all at another webinar. Thank you very much.